Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 56th Annual University Lecture. The lecture series is one of the great traditions at Boston University. Established in 1950, the lectures have become a highlight of the academic calendar. They recognize that the accomplished teacher can report on research and thought not only to fellow specialists, but to general audiences, and in language which is comprehensible to intelligent listeners, which I assume all of us are in this audience. We should be suspicious of claims that the matter of a particular discipline is too complex for general understanding by the public. While it is true, for example, that our knowledge of DNA was first gained by specialists working at the frontiers of genetics, the subject is now deservedly part of what the educated person knows and can talk about. The tradition of public lectures by great experts is an important function of universities. Our lecturer tonight, Professor William Carroll, earned his undergraduate degree at Oberlin and his graduate degrees at Yale. In the 33 years since he joined our faculty, he has established a remarkable record as a scholar, teacher, and academic administrator. He has published extensively, and he is one of those prolific writers for whom quality comes first and quantity is a consequence of intense application and energy. Generations of Boston University students have learned how to write from him and how to understand authors as diverse as Shakespeare and Nabokov. On the sound principle that if scholars do not administer at universities, then non-scholars will, Professor Carroll has been a backbone of the administration of his departments and college. He was director of graduate studies for his department in 1989, and after a respite between 1992 and 97, he has continued performing this crucial service to the present. It is a measure of his versatility, no less than his devotion, that between 1987 and 1989, he was the interim chairman of the Department of Art History. But it's fair to say that nothing has fixed his attention more than the works of William Shakespeare. It is also fair to say that the bard has not been ignored by the rest of the world. For example, Google has approximately 17 million hits for Shakespeare. Professor Carroll's presentations on Shakespeare in print, in the classroom, and in the lecture hall show not merely that there is always something new and useful to say about the bard, but something essential. Shakespeare had choice words to say about many things. In Sonnet 66, he said, I quote, "Art made tongue-tied by authority." Perhaps this use of authority was referring to troubles with censorship. But Professor Carroll is a great authority on Shakespeare, and it has not made him tongue-tied. Quite to the contrary, as you are about to learn. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor William Carroll.
Thank you very much, President Chapanian. Friends, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, my thanks to you for coming here tonight at this busy time of year. I'm greatly honored to be here speaking in this great tradition of university lectures. And I'm particularly honored and flattered by President Chebanian's introduction. As I was listening to it, I felt a little bit like the Thane of Cawdor just before he was taken away to be executed. Nothing in his life became him like the introducing it. And speaking of Cawdor, I'm also pleased as I begin to speak about the infamous Scottish play, whose name I will pronounce openly shortly, to have a member of the Clan Campbell present tonight, Provost David Campbell, who may know that one of the main branches of the Campbells in 16th century Scotland was that of the Cawdor Campbells. The date of tonight's lecture, furthermore, comes just 5 days after the traditional date of Shakespeare's birth in 1564, making him 441 years old. And we're just a few months short of the 400th anniversary of the gunpowder plot conspiracy, part of the context of Shakespeare's Macbeth. So if something goes wrong tonight, there have been plenty of warnings. Before beginning, I would also like to thank the Provost and especially Randy Rubenstein and P.J. Jorgensen of the Provost's office for guiding me through this process and making it happen. My thanks also to Diana Parziali, the head of the Design Department and Publications, for the splendid poster she created from the images I sent her. This is going to be one of the few lectures you'll ever hear that will have difficulty living up to the poster. Finally, I would also like to recognize those students from my present and recent undergraduate Shakespeare courses and those graduate students from my seminars on Jacobean drama and culture. Their questions and responses to Macbeth have been important in shaping my thinking about the play. And my colleagues in early modern literature in the Department of English have provided immeasurable support and intellectual sustenance over the years. My lecture has 3 parts, for those of you who will be counting. A brief introduction, then 2 sections of more or less equal length. I have a number of images to show tonight, and I should explain that some of them are not of the highest quality, for which I apologize, but given the age of the materials and the quality of the image I was able to obtain, they're not always crystal clear. So, Macbeth and the Show of Kings, introduction. When Shakespeare awoke on the morning of March 24th, 1603, he might have heard, as many in London did, the proclamation read by Robert Cecil announcing the death of Queen Elizabeth that night and the succession of James VI, the King of Scots, to the throne of England as James I. Trumpets and heralds proceeded to the various city gates to repeat the proclamation, which was heard, according to one observer, with great expectation and silent joy. Elizabeth's death had long been anticipated, but the peaceful transition to James's ascent was a surprise to many at the time. Her approaching death was accompanied by dire predictions of chaos and bloodshed, perhaps even civil war, for Elizabeth had failed in what many saw as the chief duty of the monarch, to produce a viable heir and continue the lineal succession of sovereign power. The Virgin Queen had remained childless. But James VI of Scotland, descended from the line issuing from Henry VIII's sister Margaret, Henry VII's eldest daughter, claimed the crown on the grounds of direct lineal descent. Parliament quickly passed the Succession Act that, after tracing James's line on the English side, pronounced a most joyful and just recognition of James's immediate, lawful, and undoubted succession, descent, and right of the crown as next and sole heir of the blood royal. In addition to the blood royal, James also possessed 2 other considerable and more practical assets. He was male, and he had 2 male sons, plus a daughter, just in case of emergency. Shakespeare had thus survived the most momentous political event of his lifetime, not just the succession of a new monarch, but the institution of a new royal house, the Stewarts. The prevailing critical interpretation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, without serious challenge until about 20 years ago, has been termed the King James or authorized version, that the play was written in late 1605 or early 1606 to flatter or please the recently crowned King James, and that its setting in Scotland and its thickly embedded allusions to contemporary events reflect not only James's homeland, but his own intellectual interests, such as witchcraft, for James had published a book on witchcraft in 1597. The play, it was argued, affirms an orthodox Stewart interpretation of history, showing that royal legitimacy won in the end. The overthrow of the usurper Macbeth not only led to the rightful succession of Malcolm, but more importantly, as we shall see, to the ascendancy of the Stuarts from the descendants of Banquo, hence to the very monarch who was presumably viewing the play with complacent satisfaction. Yet much recent scholarly work, such as that of David Norbrook, has undermined the traditional authorized version of the play, revealing the gaps, fissures, and contradictions within it, while at the same time redirecting our view to the contested political discourse of the period. First, powerful arguments by James Buchanan, King James's tutor in Scotland, and many continental writers justified tyrannicide, the idea that a monarch who had become a tyrant could lawfully be deposed, a position King James specifically attempts to refute in his own writing. And second, polemicists asserted that the kingship itself, far from being an absolute divine right, was to some extent a constructed relationship between the people and the monarch, and that the people, as in any contractual relationship, had the right to change monarchs when they felt it necessary. James had worked hard to counter this argument, too, in his political writings. But James's position was losing ground historically, as his son Charles I pointedly discovered in 1649 when his head was chopped off. Shakespeare's play, too, chops off the head of one of its Scottish kings. Moreover, it stages the murder of not one but two kings, amply justifies tyrannicide, and seems to suggest that the institution of lineal succession by Duncan is a disaster. The play seems less a piece of flattery to James than an example of the early modern discourses that constituted and contested sovereignty. My intention today is to take up one strand in the historiographical reexamination of Macbeth and to suggest another dimension of the play's intervention in its historical moment. My point of departure will be two questions my students frequently ask. First, Macbeth, you will recall, slays the rebels attempting to overthrow the lawful King Duncan, then receives the prophecy from the witches that he shall be king hereafter. Along with Banquo, who has received his own prophecy, Macbeth then returns to Duncan's camp where rewards are promised. The first question is, why is Macbeth so upset when Duncan names his eldest son Malcolm the Prince of Cumberland? As Macbeth says in an aside, that is a step on which I must fall down or else o'erleap, for in my way it lies. In other words, what could Macbeth's expectations have been? 2, the witches prophesy that Banquo will be lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier, because they tell him, thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. The second question is, if Banquo is to be father to a line of kings, why isn't his son Fleance around at the end of the play? You recall that Fleance has fled when Macbeth's hired murderers kill his father. And why is Fleance apparently forgotten in the coronation of Malcolm? The first question has a deceptively simple answer. The Scotland of Shakespeare's play has an elective, not an inherited monarchy. One of the things I want to investigate today is what this apparent fact means in terms of the play's continuing focus on the concept of succession. The answer to the second question, where is Fleance, will require a longer and more complicated answer. I will begin with an examination of the discipline of genealogy in the early modern period, and after this detour, return to the ghost that haunts Macbeth's future. Part 1, the genealogical imperative. Given James's substantial assets, royal blood, 2 sons, and the alleged deathbed approval of Queen Elizabeth, the question arises in retrospect why there was ever any doubt that he would be Queen Elizabeth's successor. James's royal succession looked on paper quite clear, as a modern genealogical chart shows. That should be the handout you have. Here we have the typical modern genealogical tree with its standard features. It goes back only to Henry VII. It omits all the children who did not figure in the eventual history of succession. It omits the bastard children and adulterous lovers. And it is drawn in clear, straight lines, sharp right angles, moving top to bottom in chronological order, suggesting as well as representing the absolute clarity of descent. It is genealogy as teleology, everything leading inexorably and simply to James I. But this type of chart is also genealogy as an expression of ideology. It represents politics as natural destiny. It's a visual incarnation of the Succession Act that had proclaimed James to be king. In the decade before Elizabeth's death, however, the genealogical picture was not so clear. Robert Parsons, for example, a Jesuit intellectual and polemicist, published a lengthy work in 1595 that challenged James's possible succession. Parsons argued that as many as a dozen people had substantial claims, especially his preferred candidate, the eldest daughter to the King of Spain, the Infanta Isabel, who would, he hoped, return England to Catholic rule. But even some Protestants, such as Thomas Wilson in 1601, observed that there are 12 competitors that gape for the death of that good old princess, the now queen. Elizabeth's own godson, Sir John Harrington, said in 1602 that it had been, in fact, the policy of the state that as a counterpoise to the claim of Mary, Queen of Scots, James's mother, some other titles should, quote, underhandedly be set on foot at home. Here, then, is Parsons' considerably more muddled genealogical chart. I have the first image. The chart is not a tree, but a whole forest, so heavy it has to be turned on its side. The legend at the upper left says, "This is a perfect and exact arbor and genealogy of all the kings, queens, and princes of the blood royal of England." At the left margin, the arbor begins with William the Conqueror. Sorry, you can't actually see the writing so clearly. Just to his left, off the margins of the page, lies the historical period covered in Shakespeare's Macbeth, in the reign of Edward the Confessor. Edward is the English king in Macbeth to whose court Malcolm flees. He will send 10,000 English soldiers to help liberate Scotland. On the right margin of the chart, however, there is nothing like the originating single solidity implied by the branch of William the Conqueror. Rather, here is an efflorescence of chaotic, even embarrassing growth. Strong saplings, noxious weeds, withered branches starve for genetic nourishment. James is actually over there. Here, too, are illegitimate sons, but not daughters, disinherited sons, and pointed personal histories. Edward V, put to death by his uncle, King Richard. Hoel, disinherited by his father, and so forth. And in place of the ex post facto perspective of James's inevitability, we have instead 12 different persons that, by way of succession, do pretend each one of them to be next after Her Majesty that now is. Clearly a quite different view, for Parsons' intention was not to cast light, but to mystify and confuse. James and his supporters, therefore, had to demolish the succession claims of several others, as well as to fend off attacks on his own claims. His liabilities as lineal successor were, in fact, nearly as great as his assets. His enemies pointed out that there were nearer claimants in the House of Lancaster, that he was excluded by the common law of England, which barred all foreigners born outside the realm from inheriting within the realm, that Henry VIII's will, confirmed by 2 acts of Parliament, had established his sister Mary's line as having a prior claim to Margaret's, that James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been put to death for conspiring against the life of Queen Elizabeth, and hence by act of Parliament she and all her heirs lost all right, title, pretense, or claim to the crown of England, and so forth. Even those who supported James's claim, like the Scottish theologian John Leslie in 1584, a Catholic supporter of Mary, produced genealogical charts that obfuscated James's claim as much as they supported it. Next image. Like Parsons, this tree also begins with William the Conqueror, but his position now represents the ground, the beginning of present history, not a branch, but the root. James is somewhere up there. At the top is a similar arboreal plenitude and confusion. As similar as the Parsons and Leslie genealogies are, however, they were used to prove exactly the opposite point. To short-circuit now a long historical narrative, James' peaceful ascent to the throne and his triumph over all the other claimants was largely made possible by 2 things. One, his claim, though shaky in many ways, was nonetheless a very strong one. And 2, more importantly, he had reached a secret agreement with Elizabeth's chief minister, Robert Cecil, who stage managed the succession for James and then announced it to the nation. The unruly genealogical arbors of Leslie, Parsons, and others would eventually be pruned and thinned out by the authority of historical hindsight. Genealogy would be written by the winners. The issue of succession would be transmuted by possession, and genealogies representing symmetry and harmony were produced where there really was none, as in this chart by Ronald Elstrack. Next image, where we have a completely harmonious and symmetrical up to James at the top, and the next one by Benjamin Wright. Similar thing. That's Mary, Queen of Scots. The handshake represents marriage and union. You can see she's ambidextrous because she had two husbands. What we would today consider genealogy developed in the late 14th and 15th centuries from the position of the herald. The herald's task was to reveal or confirm nobility through heraldic devices, and in doing so, heralds frequently had to articulate pedigree or descent. The formulation of charts and tables soon followed. By the late 1500s, producing genealogical charts and tables had become a serious business. The College of Arms received its current charter as the official guarantor of the degrees of honor and descent in 1555. Like all businesses, however, the craft of genealogy became susceptible to fraud and counterfeiting, or just wishful thinking. Sir Thomas Smith complained as early as 1583 of heralds who would for money give one, quote, arms newly made and invented, the title whereof shall pretend to have been found by the said herald in perusing and viewing of old registers. In 1605, one of the heralds of arms complained, I find that I am of less esteem since I came into that office than I was before, for I feel the office hath somewhat disgraced me, insomuch that now by the lewd demeanor of some, the name of herald has become odious and will fall to the ground. In Satiric Character Studies of 1628, John Earle broadly sketched the stereotype of the herald. His trade is honor, and he sells it and gives arms himself, though he be no gentleman. He does with gentry like some shameless queen, fathers more children on them than ever they were begot. By the end of the 17th century, the figure of the dubious herald was mocked on the stage. In his play Aesop, the comic playwright John Vanbrugh brought in the sycophantic character Jacob Quaint, who introduces himself to Aesop, Sir, I'm a genealogist. Aesop, he understands, is contemplating marriage, and he offers his services to produce Aesop's pedigree as a suitable wedding gift. Quaint begins from memory with Noah and his 3 sons. He boasts, I could take it further, but I begin at Noah for brevity's sake. Pressed by Aesop as to his truthfulness, Quaint admits that I have debated the business a little with my conscience. Certainly, genealogy became a familiar practice in 16th century England. The very identity of the nation was founded upon the invented genealogy of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who claimed that Britain was founded by the imaginary Brute, or Brutus, grandson of Aeneas, 2,000 years before the Christian era. Brute supposedly founded London as Troy Novant and begat a long line of kings, not ending until the death of King Arthur. Several historians of the Tudor period, such as Polydore Virgil, disputed such claims, but the claim remained, the story of Brute remained in literary and historical works throughout the period and served as a powerful genealogical narrative of national identity. One up-and-coming young playwright paid the College of Arms in 1596 to renew his father's application from 20 years earlier for the following coat of arms. Next image. The grant was awarded to John Shakespeare on the grounds that he had been a Queen's officer, a bailiff in Stratford, and had lands and tenements worth £500. The motto for the shield was written in 2 different forms in the Herald's report, non sans droit and non, sans droit. Without the comma, it reads, not without right, a fairly weak assertion, I'd say. While with the comma, it reads, no, without right, i.e., not justified. As an officer of the Queen, Shakespeare's father was justified in such a claim, but others were skeptical about the playwright's entitlement to this distinction. In 1602, the York Herald accused the man who had made the grant of improperly elevating base persons to positions of honor and drew up a list of cases of abuse. Among them was the Shakespeare crest, contemptuously labeled here, Shakespeare the Player. Shakespeare's great contemporary, Ben Jonson, seems to have known about the incident, for in one of his plays, a rustic clown who has just paid £30 for his coat of arms is mocked with its motto, "Not without mustard." Shakespeare, we can safely say, had some personal experience with the College of Arms in the production of new titles. More authentically noble families commissioned their own pedigree charts for special occasions, however, such as this one made for the union by marriage of the Howards and the Mowbrays. Next image. Very elaborate one there. Very noble families. Or this next one for the Campbells of Glenarcree. This is the provost's ancestor who only seems to be lying down on the job. You notice it's even color-coded by gender and title and rank and so on. The genealogical imagination structured and informed many different disciplines of knowledge. Genealogical tables were employed to support claims of inheritance in lawsuits and legal controversies. Next image. And the next image. This is part of a lawsuit with James Percy. They appeared in local histories. Next image. Typical description kind of book. They appeared also in national chronicles. Next image. John Speed's History of Britain with the line of the Saxons. Next image. Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World. The origin of the genealogical impulse was, of course, the Bible, which provided a seemingly inexhaustible fount of material. Next image. Here we have the genealogy of Adam and so on down. Next image. This is actually Adam's shield. Adam was a gentleman, as we know. These are his three sons and their growth. Next image. Next image. As you can see, the table shows everything flowing down again through the generations. Next image. These go on for hundreds of pages, by the way. Next image. Next image. Okay. We tend to think of the genealogical table or chart as strictly an embodiment of chronology and history, but could also represent the conceptual, the liberal arts, for example. Next image. This is, it's hard to see, but these are all the liberal arts. This is actually, looks like an organizational chart of CAS. All there. Among them, one example, and every one of these is illustrated. The next image, please, is rhetoric. And those are all the orders of rhetoric laid out in the various categories. Such charts could also represent the principles of salvation and damnation. Next image. This is what to avoid. There's the various things there. Next image, the Universal Church Catholic, of which the Church of Rome is just one of many instances of the universal church. One writer described his chart as a visual catechism. The early modern genealogical tree embodied above all the hierarchical and patriarchal structure of society and thought, with all relation flowing clearly and directly from the Father, here at the very center of meaning. Next image. It all flows from him. But the genealogical focus I'm pursuing here was that of the political, specifically the Jacobean claim to the English crown, and how it will appear in Macbeth. James had royal blood through the English line from Margaret, but he was also at pains to establish the lines of his Scottish descent, which could, it was claimed, be traced back, as Vanbrugh's genealogy offered, to Noah, or Fergus, or the lost tribes of Israel, depending on the genealogist. Thus, prior to and shortly after his ascent to the English throne, James's supporters began to publish ever more elaborate royal genealogies. It would not be an exaggeration to say that a campaign of lineal purification was undertaken. In 1604, George Owen Harry published the ne plus ultra of such works, entitled, here's the full title, The genealogy of the high and mighty monarch James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, with his lineal descent from Noah, by diverse direct lines to Brutus, first inhabitor of this Isle of Britain, and from him to Cadwallader, the last king of the British blood, and from thence sundry ways to his majesty, wherein is plainly showed his rightful title by lawful descent. With page after page of genealogical narrative in multiple columns, first image, from Noah, you see the different columns, next image, again, each column is a different line being traced in prose. Next image, even more elaborate. Next image, until we arrive at James, King of Scotland, the very last item in the long book. Written texts in the first few years of James's reign in England also presented the genealogical imperative at length. Panegyric welcomings of the new king not only congratulated him on uniting the kingdoms in his own person, but for bringing such a pure hereditary line to the job. In effect, James and his supporters continued to fight the genealogical battle against Parsons and others who had disputed his claims for decades after his ascent, in fact, well into the next century, long after both Parsons and James were dead. Among the most important claims supporting James's succession in England was the descent of the House of Stewart from Welsh royalty. Thus, James would already have had English royal blood, even if there had been no connection through Margaret. The descent from the Welsh began, it was said, in the aftermath of the reign of Macbeth, King of Scotland. Here's the genealogy as represented by John Leslie, the Catholic supporter of Mary. Next image. This famous image purports to show the origin of the Stuarts. At the very top of the tree is Jacobus, up there, our James, and next his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. We count down from James through 9 monarchs and then through several others to Fleance, at the very foundation, and at the very foundation, solid as a rock, is Banquo, the Banquo of Shakespeare's play. Thus, the link is established from Banquo in the reign of Macbeth, who was the 85th King of Scotland, to James VI, the 106th King of Scotland. As many historians told the tale, when Banquo was murdered by Macbeth's men, Fleance fled to Wales, where he impregnated the Welsh princess. The furious father conceived such hateful displeasure towards Fleance that he killed him. The daughter delivered a bastard and now fatherless son, Walter. When he was a young man, Walter was taunted that he was a bastard and begotten in unlawful bed, and in anger he killed his tormentor, fled Wales for Scotland, achieved honor and reputation there, and so was made Lord Steward of Scotland, hence the family name Steward or Stewart. Several generations later, one of the Stewart descendants married Marjorie Bruce, daughter of Robert Bruce, and their offspring became Robert II, and the rest followed more or less in orderly fashion, leading to James. One wonders why this genealogy would have been a comforting narrative of origin for James, or any of the Stuarts, since it involves a possible rape, illegitimacy, murder, and a kind of rags-to-riches story that hardly reflects ancient nobility. But this genealogy, the founding myth of the Stuart dynasty, was, as you might by now expect, a product of the imagination, not historical fact. Banquo and Fleance were invented by the early Scottish historian Hector Boece in 1527. Prior to his work, no such persons had ever appeared in chronicles, court records, or any other document. We can only speculate on Boece's motives in manufacturing Banquo and Fleance, but the result is clear. They solidified the line of Stuart succession and produced a direct derivation from the Welsh, hence English line for the Stuarts, as well as connecting the Stuarts to the long Scottish line back to Noah. Within a few decades, the Banquo-Fleance myth had congealed into accepted historical fact, except for a few skeptical historians, such as Sir George Buck, who in 1605, in a work otherwise rhapsodic in its praises of James and his royal blood, discreetly said that this alleged descent, not being acknowledged by the best Scottish historiographers and the thing not honorable, I may well omit it. In the first few years after 1603, then, the Jacobean regime and its supporters, though firmly in power and without any substantial political rivals, continued to assert, reaffirm, and in all ways pronounce as absolute the lineal authority and blood legitimacy of their monarch. In dozens of texts and genealogical charts, James's claim was propped up and even extended so far that one sympathetic Scottish historian claimed, "The title of every race which has at different times ruled England is united in the person of our most gracious king." Part 2, Shakespeare and the King's Men. It's hardly an exaggeration, then, to say that the most important domestic political issue between 1588, the year that saw the defeat of the Spanish Armada and possibly Shakespeare's arrival in London to begin his playwriting career, and 1603, was the question of Queen Elizabeth's successor. Shakespeare's great arc of 8 linked history plays, written between 1588 and 1599, represented the Wars of the Roses from the reign of Richard II to the death of Richard III and the founding of the Tudor dynasty, the same dynasty that was about to collapse for lack of an heir. This historical cycle can in part be understood as a long, anguished exploration of the issues, often catastrophic in nature, of lineal succession, as each king awaits, or at times helpfully initiates, the death of his predecessor. 2 years before James's accession, Shakespeare had already, in Hamlet, explored the unsettled state of Denmark, a political world in which the sole eldest son of the rightful king had not inherited the throne, because the Denmark of the play, like the Scotland of Macbeth, was an elective, not an inherited monarchy. Lamenting that Claudius had popped in between the election and my hopes, Hamlet struggles to inherit his father's strength and bravery, if not his kingdom. At the end, dying, Hamlet can only accept, as a fact of realpolitik, that the invading foreigner Fortinbras will take over the Danish crown. I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice. A gesture of defeat made worse by the fact that Fortinbras not only has Hamlet's vote, but has appropriated, even as it has silenced, Hamlet's own voice. And in King Lear in 1605, just the year before Macbeth, Shakespeare had explored the chaos attending a monarch without a son who divided his inheritance, or attempted to, among 3 daughters, with a subplot of an equally misguided father who disowned his eldest legitimate son to divert his inheritance to his younger bastard son. These plays suggest that, like many other writers of the period, Shakespeare understood the complexities and betrayals of succession. For him, it seems the principle of primogeniture that underlay lineal succession was not necessarily a good thing, much less a divinely ordained one. In his first few years as King of England, James had managed to become widely unpopular among the English nobility for diluting and corrupting the honor system by granting literally thousands of knighthoods to whomever could pay. And many of these new knights were Scots who had flooded down to London to partake of the new king's largesse. As one English observer put it, the Scots hang like horse leeches on James till they could get no more, falling then off by retiring into their own country or living at ease, leaving all chargeable attendance to the English. New titles of nobility were granted wholesale by the profligate James. Even more seriously, a small group of radical Catholics, bitterly opposed to James's Protestant rule, began to plot against him. This group, whose most infamous member was Guy Fawkes, attempted to blow up Parliament, the royal family, and virtually all the political and legal bureaucracy of the kingdom on November 5th, 1605, the Gunpowder Plot conspiracy as it became known. Shakespeare alludes to this conspiracy in the Porter's speech in Act 2 of Macbeth. Shakespeare's theatrical company had been granted royal patronage and become the king's men upon James's ascent, marching in his coronation entry into London wearing the king's livery. But if they intended to flatter their king by staging a Scottish play in the first few years of his reign, their aim seems to have been off. London audiences certainly had a strong curiosity about this strange country and their still largely unknown king. And this curiosity was fed through the circulation and publication of things Scottish. But in 1604, Shakespeare's company had staged a play entitled The Tragedy of Gowrie, an account of events of 1600 when James was still in Scotland. His archenemy, the Earl of Gowrie, had allegedly tried to assassinate James, but Gowrie himself and his brother, according to the sole record of the event issued by James's government, were killed in the incident. Many people at the time openly doubted the official account. Shakespeare's company had inexplicably been permitted to stage this play, but they were forced to shut it down after only 2 performances. If that representation of treason, attempted regicide, and royal deliverance was found unacceptable, what is there about Macbeth, the second Scottish play Shakespeare's company mounted in 2 years, that might have been found flattering to James or his Scottish allies? The Scotland of Shakespeare's Macbeth is, after all, a site of disorder, rebellion, treason, foreign invasions, wild kerns and gallowglasses, blasted heaths, frightening tempests, ominous sounds. Even brutal warriors, like the merciless MacDonald, suffer mutilation and dismemberment. Macbeth, the captain reports, unseamed him from the nave to the chops and fixed his head upon our battlements. The clash of armies at the beginning of the play is so great and terrible, the captain tells us, that it reminds him of another Golgotha, the place of the crucifixion, where men seem to bathe in reeking wounds. All this without even taking into account the queasy, unsettling presence of the witches. In this violently aggressive world, haunted by strange images of death, a Thane's success in battle rightly received reward from his king, and the coin of the realm in Macbeth is evidently noble titles. The witches prophesy to Macbeth 3 titles that will be his: Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, King hereafter. Macbeth demands that the witches explain further. By Sinel's death, Sinel was his father, I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Cawdor. But the treasonous Thane of Cawdor, whom Macbeth has defeated in the king's name, has been condemned to death and is soon executed. By Sinel's death, then, Macbeth has become Thane of Glamis. By Cawdor's death, Macbeth has become Thane of Cawdor. How else could he become king, then, but by Duncan's death? Or how could anyone? For that is the worm at the heart of succession. Succession requires, indeed, it is inseparable from death. And the form of death is irrelevant, whether the subject be Macbeth's own father, Sinel, or his father king, Duncan. The witch's prophecy to Banquo at first seems different, more positive. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. But Banquo's death will also be required. When the traitors are all quelled, Macbeth and Banquo attend the king, who fulsomely praises his worthiest cousin. The sin of my ingratitude even now is heavy on me. Thou art so far before that swiftest wing of recompense is slow to overtake thee. Would thou hadst less deserved, that the proportion both of thanks and payment might have been mine. Only I have left to say, more is thy due than more than all can pay. I have begun to plant thee and will labor to make thee full of growing. What Macbeth was surely expecting to hear next as his reward, the honor he had earned in battle while Duncan and his sons remained safely behind the lines, is that Duncan would name him his heir apparent, his successor. The principle of royal succession in the Scotland of the play is that of election, usually of the worthiest thane, not necessarily the sovereign's firstborn son. Even more to the point, the kingship, according to the chronicles, was to alternate between parallel lines of descent, and Duncan and Macbeth were cousins. Malcolm, moreover, was in the sources a minor, not of able age, and prohibited from inheriting. Nevertheless, Duncan turns away from Macbeth and Banquo to announce proudly, "Sons, kinsmen, thanes, and you whose places are the nearest, know, we will establish our estate upon our eldest, Malcolm, whom we name hereafter the Prince of Cumberland." Duncan thus alters the ancient Scottish system by turning it into one of primogeniture and lineal succession. And he makes the very mistake that Queen Elizabeth had been so careful not to make, naming one's own successor. Urged to name Mary Queen of Scots, James's mother, her heir presumptive, Elizabeth replied, "Think you that I could love my own winding sheet? Princes cannot like their own children, those that should succeed unto them. In assuring her of the succession, we might put our present state in doubt." As Elizabeth had feared, and Macbeth's aside reveals, Duncan has just spoken his own death warrant. After Duncan's murder, which Macbeth blames on Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, who have fled, Ross logically concludes, then 'tis most like the sovereignty will fall upon Macbeth, to which Macduff reports without comment, he was already named and gone to Scone to be invested. But while Macbeth has now become the lawful king, he cannot rest, for he soon recalls the witch's prophecy about Banquo. Then prophet-like they hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. If it be so, for Banquo's issue have I defiled my mind, for them, the gracious Duncan, have I murdered, to make them kings, the seeds of Banquo kings. Ironically, Macbeth now wishes that he had a son who would succeed him in the kingship. Here then, in Macbeth's obsession with his own succession, may be the explanation of Banquo's unusual prominence in Shakespeare's play. In the sources of the story that Shakespeare used, Banquo is an active co-conspirator against Duncan, not the moral figure of Shakespeare's play, who experiences some temptation, but in contrast to Macbeth, would do only that which would still keep his bosom franchised and allegiance clear. Shakespeare thus decontaminates the Banquo of his sources, perhaps because he is here so prominently the origin of the Stewart line. Certainly, Banquo's importance to Macbeth dominates the center of the play. Indeed, after the murder of Duncan and Macbeth's ascent to the throne, Macbeth's first act as king is a clever interrogation of Banquo's travel plans so that hired assassins can intercept and kill him in Fleance. Moreover, it's striking that Shakespeare does not show Macbeth haunted by the ghost of Duncan, the Scottish king, father figure, kinsman, who has been so clear in his great office that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. Instead, after the murder of Banquo in Act 3 and Fleance's escape to his genealogical destiny, Macbeth is literally haunted by the ghost of Banquo, especially, I think, by the manner of his appearance. According to the Folio stage direction, the ghost of Banquo enters, quote, and sits in Macbeth's place at the banquet table. In his near hysterical reaction to the ghost, whom no one else sees, Macbeth tells his wife, the time has been that when the brains were out, the man would die and there an end. But now they rise again with 20 mortal murders on their crowns and push us from our stools. Macbeth refers to the 20 or more mortal gashes that Banquo has in his head, but the line also suggests by the use of the word crowns that Banquo has in effect been crowned by his murder, and that he will push Macbeth from his stool or place, just as Macbeth pushed Duncan from his. This harrowing vision leads Macbeth to seek out the witches himself, to know by the worst means the worst. Banquo had warned in the first act that the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence. But Macbeth is now indifferent to anything but the future. The unknown power that speaks the second set of prophecies knows Macbeth's thought and tells him the future. Beware the Thane of Fife. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. But these prophecies are not enough, and Macbeth demands more. Yet my heart throbs to know one thing. Tell me, if your art can tell so much, shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom? A question that, of course, had already been answered back in the first act. At which point, the witches call forth a show of 8 kings, and Banquo last with a glass in his hand, according to the Folio stage direction. The vision of Banquo's progeny, each of whom looks like Banquo, living on as kings, overcomes Macbeth. What, will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? Worse, the last figure carries the glass or mirror, which shows me many more, an infinitely receding number of Banquo kings. This vision of Banquo's line stretching out to the crack of doom, with the 8th king holding a mirror in which many more appear, may extend even to the reigning monarch, James himself, perhaps sitting in the audience. As I've tried to suggest with the earlier material, Shakespeare's audience would surely not have been surprised to encounter this genealogical chorus line, For the show of kings was a recurring feature of royal discourse for 2 centuries and more, and had been prominently displayed in the early years of James's reign as part of his campaign of lineal reaffirmation. Such shows presented the unbroken line of kings from Noah, next image, there's Noah, next image, to the present, Henry VIII, 7th, Henry VIII, and so on. It's about 30 pages of kings. This is truly the fatal vision that shatters Macbeth, so devastating that at the end of the scene, he sweeps off to even greater acts of tyranny and savagery, beginning with the wholly unnecessary slaughter of Macduff's family. It's no wonder that in one of the greatest speeches Shakespeare ever wrote, Macbeth should so feel the burden of time and history, the future he cannot evade. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. For Macbeth, this vision of life's succession of days is just a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But for the Stewarts, it is a tale of the greatest significance, an account of sovereign destiny. The show of kings in Act 4, then, takes its place among the genealogical discourses of early Stuart England, bringing to life and putting on the stage those royal predecessors of the reigning monarch. Here, if anywhere, we might conclude that Shakespeare was attempting to flatter his king. And yet, if we return to Leslie's famous tree, next image, and look more closely at Shakespeare's text, we realize that Shakespeare's show of 8 kings is 1 king short of the 9 needed to reach James. The missing monarch is, of course, James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who has been thoroughly erased from the historical scene. Mary's disappearance from the play is certainly part of the more general erasure and suppression of the maternal in this play, as it has been described by such critics as Janet Edelman. But I would also argue that in creating this very deliberate gap in the line of succession, Shakespeare was not only avoiding an unpleasant subject, but revealing his own skepticism about succession in general and about the Stewart claims in particular. James's mother had herself suffered a by now familiar fate. Her head chopped off in 1587 as a traitor accused of plotting regicide. And James had, in 1606, the year of the play, commissioned a monument to be built in Westminster Abbey, to which, when it was completed, he had his mother's coffin transferred. James owed his own kingship to his mother's deposition and ultimately her death. Meanwhile, her plots against Queen Elizabeth had become notorious. The less said about Mary, it seems, the better, but her highly conspicuous absence in the play, in fact, marks her unavoidable, disturbing presence. The end of the play, as many readers have noted, accompanies Malcolm's coronation with an uncanny series of repetitions. Macduff has entered with Macbeth's head, just as Macbeth had beheaded MacDonald at the beginning of the play. Malcolm has taken no part in the battle, but left it all to Macduff, just as his father Duncan relied on Macbeth. The worthiest Thane, Macduff, kneels to profess his loyalty to King Malcolm, just as Macbeth had done to King Duncan. Malcolm promises rewards to his followers with the same metaphor that Duncan had used in the first act. What's more to do which would be planted newly with the time, he promises, he will perform and measure time and place. And like Duncan before him, he hands out titles to those who have slain the enemy. My thanes and kinsmen henceforth be earls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honor named. In creating new honors, Malcolm may be attempting to circumvent the high mortality rate of current title holders, but given what we know of the Scotland of the play, he has in effect just handed out even more death sentences. Worse yet, when Macduff enters with Macbeth's head, he greets Malcolm himself with his new title, Hail, King, for so thou art. Behold where stands the usurper's cursed head. A salutation repeated again by Macduff and then by everyone, Hail, King of Scotland. This form of salutation links Malcolm with Macbeth, who is greeted by the witches, All hail, Macbeth, hail to thee, and by Lady Macbeth, by the all hail hereafter, thus also linking the weird sisters with the victorious Scots. Malcolm has necessarily gained his new title, as everyone seems to do in Scotland, through an act of violence. The reign of Malcolm, moreover, the chronicles tell us, was like those of almost all Scottish kings in this period, plagued by rebellions, large and small, to which he would routinely dispatch Macduff to suppress them. After one such incident, and a by now unsurprising repetition, Macduff returned to the king with the head of the captain of that rout, so that for his manhood herein showed, he was made by the king Earl of March. Malcolm's reign, in fact, became known, like James's, for his excessive generosity in granting titles of honor. He created many earls, lords, barons, and knights. Many of them that before were thanes were at this time made earls. Malcolm's lineal descent, according to the chronicle histories, Malcolm's lineal succession to the throne seems to have carried with it no more authority than that conferred by the earlier principle of succession by election. Finally, where, to return to the second of my original questions, is the founder of the Stewart line at the end of the play? Fleance is gone, fled into the darkness without a word as his father Banquo is murdered. His absence strikes me as equally as significant as the absence of Mary, Queen of Scots in the Show of Kings. The gap between Malcolm's coronation and the origin of the Stewart line is precisely the vacancy that royal genealogists had attempted to fill, but Shakespeare leaves it empty, the future uncertain. Duncan's establishment of primogeniture as the new system of succession in Scotland was seen by the Stuarts as the key to James's own claims of the crown through lineal inheritance. But Shakespeare reveals the troubling consequences of Duncan's actions and the clear, if guarded, impression that Duncan's action was a violation of law and tradition. The fact that he had to name Malcolm his heir marks the very novelty of the act. In the end, Shakespeare's play represents succession as still a vexed, unresolved question. For at the center of Macbeth and its complex genealogical context throbs a spectral vision of missing heads, chopped off, erased, forgotten. The line of heads will stretch from MacDonald to Macbeth and the armed head of the prophecies to Mary, Queen of Scots, and eventually to James's own son, Charles. Sometimes, it seems, the Show of Kings is just a show. With the death of Macbeth, Macduff had said, "The time is free," but that declaration seems in retrospect like the most wishful thinking. Thank you. Professor Rakelmy.
First, I want to express my hope that the Presidential Search Committee takes you on as a consultant. My question has to do with some elements that you mentioned along the way, the violence and the strangeness of the play, and your speculative sense of how those elements would have meshed with or countered this invitation to think about political structures for an audience of the time. And the play seems to me, as a modern viewer, just completely over the top.
Yes.
Weird and attractive to filmmakers like Polanski, Orson Welles. So what's the interplay, the balance, or the contradiction there?
Well, it's I describe it to my classes as sort of the Dracula of Shakespeare's plays because there's more blood in it than almost any other play. But I would say it's not, by comparison with other plays we could think of, over the top at all, compared even with Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. But it certainly has an obsession with beheading and with the appearance of these floating heads. And, of course, beheading was the ultimate punishment for treason. And there's a long, elaborate description of what happens to someone who's been convicted of attempted regicide or of regicide. And after the entire body is tortured, the last thing that happens is that the head is cut off because it was the part of the body that had imagined the treason. And of course, waving over on 25 or 30 heads were on poles on top of London Bridge, waving in the breeze. And every foreign visitor remarked that when they came to London, they were quite surprised to find this is the sort of welcome to London greeting. There's a kind of paranoia of treason, I would suggest, all through the Elizabethan, but particularly in the early part of James's reign, and somehow this is like the consequence of it. I think the other thing I'd say is that within the play itself, Macbeth and his wife have a continual series of speeches and moments when they say, they call on darkness to hide their deeds. They ask that their eye not see what their hand does. They don't want to see anymore the actions that are being acted out. And in some ways, the ultimate separation of sight and consequence is to literally take the head off so that the eye can no longer see the hand. And I think that's also a figure for the kind of insanity, that ultimately happens in the play. But it's a fairly over-the-top play. I'll grant you that. Certainly a very strange play. Oh, sorry. Yes.
The way you describe the play suggests that Shakespeare actually was in some fashion challenging James I. Do you see that those elements in other plays of his? Is that a characteristic of how he produced things that had political overtones?
That's the word challenge is probably far too strong. Because after all, it was the king's men. They performed regularly at court. But I think he's skeptical of lots of things. And it's even before James comes to the crown in Hamlet and those plays in the 1590s, those history plays, I think we see lots of skepticism about the theory and principle of how the monarchy changes and succession. The irony is that during his lifetime, the only monarch he had known was Elizabeth. In fact, it's been estimated that maybe 95% of the people alive in 1603 had never known any other monarch than Elizabeth. And so they had not gone through the regime change that was about to happen. And it brought up for 10 or 15 years, actually for 2 decades, it brought up all kinds of anxieties about succession. And as it became clear that she was not going to have an heir, it only increased the anxiety. In 1571, Elizabeth had her government pass a so-called Statute of Silence, which forbade any public discussion or printing of any discussion of the succession of the monarchy, and that was 30 years before she died. So she didn't want the subject brought up, but the subject was brought up, and so I think his challenge is wrong, is too strong. But I think he's, like many people, skeptical. Yes.
I had no idea that Fleance was seen as connected with Wales. I thought it very interesting, given first Shakespeare's tendency to an anti-Welsh leaning in his plays, basically portrayal. Secondly, if Mary was suppressed as an embarrassing ancestor, with the named Tudors gone, the Welsh dragon taken off the royal standard, could it have been thought that looking back to the gentleman of the bedchamber who'd married Queen Catherine and put the Welsh directly into the line there was such a thin Lancastrian claim that Welsh connections were better forgotten?
Well, that would be our view, but you heard, for instance, in the title of the George Owen Harry thing, the line goes through Cadwallader, and so the Welsh was important because one drop of Welsh blood meant English royalty, and so however disreputable it might be in other ways, or thin a claim, any claim that had blood in it was better than any other kind of claim. And so it didn't seem to matter. And the oddness of the Fleance story with murder and illegitimate children, and he's a bastard and so forth, his son is a bastard, didn't seem to matter because it made a blood connection. But yeah, he's not a fan of the Welsh or the Scots either, for that matter, obviously. Other questions? Professor Murphy.
I just wanted to ask a really general question. How do the witches fit into all of this? And, we don't really have the mothers, but we have witches.
We have the anti-maternal in the play, don't we? The witches are the origin of the prophecies of genealogical destiny. And so it's, first of all, suspect to begin with. It's true, of course, but its origin is problematic. And remember Banquo's warning that the instruments of darkness tell us truth to win us to their harm. And I think that the witches, at least certainly in the second set of prophecies, but probably in the beginning as well, say and speak what Macbeth has already desired. He wants to be king. He expects to be king. They tell him, "You'll be king," and he says, "Right, I'll be king." You notice the prophecy, though, of course, doesn't say, "Thou shalt be king by killing a helpless old man who's asleep in his bed and drugging the two guys outside his door." They just say, "You'll be king," and in a way, it's not that. In a way, they understand, or the witches, what they say. They know what he'll do. It's the only way you can get a title in that culture is by killing your predecessor, or so it seems. But I don't know what to make really of the witches, but we'll see. We have a distinction project on that coming up. Other questions? I think we have time for more questions, if there are any.
We do, if there are any. There's one right here.
Sorry, I'm not. Oh, yeah, sure.
You say that James VI may be reflected in the glass at the end of Show of Kings, but the next line, some of them do double walls and treble sceptres there, suggests that that's a reference to James with the union of the crown.
Right.
And the treble sceptre may, I suppose, be the Page France, which is on the adjusted royal arms.
Right, signifying the three kingdoms. Right, that's right. Well, the question, certainly one question about the play has been whether James actually saw it or not, and probably he did. There was performances of Shakespeare Company staged several plays at Hampton Court in the summer of 1606 when James's brother-in-law visited the King of Denmark. There was, but there are other reports of that visit, and describing elaborate day-long drunken parties. And there's a real question whether James was ever alert enough to see the play then. It was again performed later at court, but just because a play was performed at court, it's not always clear that James was present or awake or sober. Probably he saw it, but I don't think you could count on it. And certainly the play was first staged in the Globe Theatre, where there was no monarch at all. Yes.
The theory that James would have actually been, so Nero was on stage to actually reflect James as he's sitting in the audience.
Well, that's a nice. It's a nice idea that we like to think about. It could not have happened at the Globe Theatre because James wouldn't have gone to the Globe Theatre or to the Indoor Theatre, for that matter, the Blackfriars. The other problem with the play, and knowing whether exactly what its occasion was, is that the only text we have of it is from 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, and it's been amplified or modified slightly by another playwright, Thomas Middleton, who there's some songs in the play, in the Hecate scenes that have been added apparently around 1610, 11, 12. So we don't have the text we have is not the text that was played in 1606 exactly, and we're not, we can't absolutely say what that was. But I mean, if they took it to court, then it's possible that James was, if you held the mirror up just right, that he'd be there. Professor Mandillo.
In creating geological systems, were there ever claims to astrology for justification?
That's an interesting question from an astronomer. I should have anticipated that question. There must have been. There must be something like that. The trouble is that prophecy is a dangerous act, and prophecy had been forbidden by Act of Parliament. Prophecy was associated with revolution too often, and with subversion and rebellion and so forth. Nevertheless, when the prophecies were what you wanted to hear, then they were permitted. But I have to say, I haven't looked at astrological charts or astrological books, and I'll take that up, and perhaps from your own private library I'll look at some of those. I really don't know.
That may be it, but don't leave yet.
Okay.
Thank you for that spectacular talk. And the only part of it that made me feel uncomfortable was the question from the audience about making you a consultant to the Presidential Search Committee. The way you described what happened to Kings made me feel very uneasy.
But it didn't obtain for interim monarchs.
Thank you for that. I wanted first to present to you a framed copy of the poster.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a great poster.
And also a token of our appreciation for your talk. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.